So, we all know how diabolical the Enclave and Vault Tec are, and how these two entities alone have caused untold amount of human suffering both pre- and post-Great War within the fallen universe. But one thing that never quite settled right with me is how both these organizations, and others like them, came to the conclusion that it was necessary to conduct their downright god-awful human experiments on both prisoners of war and American citizens alike, and why it was followed through with. So let's play devil's advocate for a little bit, and maybe reveal an alternative viewpoint or two for you that is often glossed over or completely forgotten about when people talk about Fallout. So to start, I think it is essential that I briefly cover some relevant lore, because to properly look into a subject, I think it is prudent to set into the context to paint a fuller, more complete picture for the audience. By 2077, America and China have been at war for 11 straight years, bleeding both sides white on all fronts from the snowy tundras of Anchorage to the sun-drenched jungles of the Philippines and blood-soaked beaches of both Nanjing and Shanghai. This sort of brutal attritional warfare is nothing new to humans, and it was just the latest chapter of it within the resource wars as a whole, which has been going on for 28 years worldwide. All nations were desperate for raw materials to fuel their coming economies, and this was especially true for America, which was not only funded Chinese abroad but an unruly and riotous civilian population at home who demanded the creature comforts and consumer products they had grown used to during the pre-war years between the end of World War II and the beginning of this resource wars. So to paraphrase, many raw materials have become scarce. Oil, the once plentiful and cheap energy source, was nearly gone, leaving vast fleets of abandoned automobiles to litter the highways once gas ran out. Factories to cease production, and both mining operations and farming to grind to a halt when no viable substitution had been brought to market. Yet tensions across the globe continued to rise. One of the first instances of conflict in the New Age was the American invasion of Mexico in 2051 to secure the oil refineries and overthrow the ineffective government that refused to cooperate, effectively turning Mexico into a satellite state of the United States after the very brief war. But the real conflict that defined the earlier period we know as the Resource Wars was a showdown between the European Commonwealth and the United Arab Coalition across the vast Middle East deserts. The European Commonwealth Middle East War lasted for 8 long years and ended a stalemate when the oil wells ran dry, making the entire conflict, which saw the first use of nuclear weapons since World War II, entirely pointless, and in the process sent the world into a major panic. America in particular took notice of the carnage and initiated Project Safe House, which was a program to build vast underground nuclear fallout shelters if worse came to worse. And only 6 years after the EC-ME war ended in 2060, China would invade Alaska in a vain attempt to take the last petroleum reserves on Earth for themselves, prompting a devastating Sino-American War, where red-blooded Americans faced down against the Red Menace on their home turf, in the Philippines and across East China, slogging through the vast human wave attacks and bodies that lived in the battlefield in the most devastating conflict the world had ever known. Enter the Vault Tec Corporation, by far the most widely recognized and despised companies within the Fallout universe, responsible for the construction, maintenance, and operation of the vaults across America, among other ventures such as video games, manufacturing, and education. So why this reputable, government-supported company ever exposed their customers to horrific experiments like in Vault 75, which purpose was to refine the genetic sequences of adolescent middle school residents to produce the perfect soldier under the guise of preparing everyone to reclaim Up Top Land as the Commonwealth was known to them, then harboring said subjects, or convincing the residents of Vault 11 that it was necessary to sacrifice one of their own each year to save the population as a whole to study the effects of human willfulness to give themselves up for the greater good. Totally not the theme of this video. So what could the logic behind conducting these experiments be? Well, to test the human condition, obviously, which would better prepare those select few who remain to one day emerge and recreate America from the post-nuclear hellscape. The Enclave, that shadowy government body that exists outside the US civilian government structure, yet is closely tied to it. From the best I can tell, this Orwellian organization pulled the strings of US society by influencing the most powerful people in the nation either through intimidation or bribery, transforming the US from a liberal, free market economy into a bloated, bureaucratic state during the Sino-American War that controlled nearly every aspect of civilian life through the most stringent of laws and a network of informants, all in the name of keeping the peace during one of the most tumultuous times in US history. Their near-obsessive pursuit of war-winning technologies ranging from revolutionary power armor schemes to energy and biological weapons led them down a dark path of involuntary human experiments on prisoners of war and American citizens alike. So what can I say to convince you, or even make you think that the Enclave is a force for good in the post-nuclear wastes and not some maniacal, borderline Nazi-esque organization that wished for complete and utter control? The simple answer would be to look at why they formed and their goals as a faction. As far as I can tell, the Enclave appears to have formed as a direct result of the Sino-American War with the objective to either win the war through any means necessary or preserve America if the unthinkable happens, a nuclear war. which is something I don't think any of us can really comprehend, much less rationalize and make informed assertions about, because none of us ever really lived through the direct threat of a nuclear conflict like that during the final years of the Sino-American War, with the intense, ever-looming threat of a bomb being dropped in an American city during the ongoing conflict. No, instead we live in a world of tentative, mutually assured destruction. So now that we've briefly covered the two most infamous groups, we can see a pattern emerging. The Enclave needed test subjects and a controlled environment to collect data, and Vault Tec was willing to provide both in exchange through an already existing program, providing a few political favors, the CEO getting a place in the Enclave for example, with maybe some additional cash thrown their way for retrofitting vaults. Simple as that, a working business agreement that benefits both parties, even if it is done illegally under the table and with the direct intention of harming innocent civilians. But the question as to why these measures were deemed necessary in the first place must still be answered, and I think that can be summed up by looking at the Sino-American War and the world as a whole by this point. As mentioned before, resources were scarce, meaning high-intensity forms of fighting, mechanized warfare, were out of the question as the fuel for it was non-existent. Limiting America's options to static trench warfare across the Anchorage front line, a desperate attempt to stem the endless horde of Chinese soldiers bearing down on the pipeline. So America utilized its war-making capacity and introduced power armor as a supplement in replacement of tanks to stabilize the front, which is where eventually the Chinese, after getting tired of banging their heads against a red, white, and blue brick wall for so long, began to deploy chemical and biological weapons in 2073 to try and turn the tides of war, which in turn inspired West Tech to begin the Pan-Immunity Virome Project, PVP, to combat biological threats, but research came to a screeching halt after the highly mutagenic concoction proved unusable in its current form because of a heightened level of aggressiveness and increased muscle mass noted within a million test subjects. The Enclave thought this virus was the perfect combination for a super soldier project, and promptly commandeered PvP and the West Tech facility for themselves, renaming it the Forced Evolutionary Virus, and began work on a strain that only increased muscle mass without loss of brain function. All of this is happening simultaneously as Big MT, with their honestly insane list of bizarre experiments, were conducting said experiments at the now mountainous facility, along with all the other defense contractors across the United States. Working day in and day out on marvelous new technologies for the war effort, the FEV and power armor were the two big ones they hoped would be war winners. But in order to test FEV properly, living humans were required, and that leads to an age-old question: do you sacrifice a few Vault Dwellers and prisoners of war to save the many Enclave in New America? While yes, it is morally reprehensible to even ask a question like this, just remember, I am playing devil's advocate here and not some morally ideal lone wanderer. Which leads me perfectly into an excellent real-life example, the dropping of the little boy and fat man atomic bombs at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, because we always go back to the nuclear options in Fallout. Do you A, completely and utterly destroy the city of Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and possibly more with nuclear hellfire, killing hundreds of thousands in mere instances, or do you B, follow through with Operation Downfall, the potential social and political repercussions that would follow from the millions dead and resentment from a brutal ground invasion? Both are hard decisions to make. It's only complicated by the concept of total war being in effect, where the entire nation, including school children and the elderly, were put to work for the war effort, being recruited as soldiers or employed within the shipyards and factories. But that is another episode in itself. Just know the effects of the nuclear bombings could and were easily replicated by the 21st Bomber Command time and time again. Just see Tokyo vs. Hiroshima here as an example of how destructive a B-29 bomber could be, killing 130,000 in the first attack alone on the capital city. So the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were undertaken to hopefully make Operation Downfall necessary, which would have involved some 5 million American and a million British and Commonwealth personnel, utterly dwarfing the invasion of Europe just 1 year prior in both size and scope, by over 1.5 million more men being deployed and a number of expected casualties with an estimated 400,000 to 800,000 American deaths and 5 to 10 million Japanese dead, which is a conservative estimate by the way. Mind you, America already suffered 417,000 dead by this point in World War II, so this one campaign would have doubled or even tripled how much American blood had been shed, and Japan, with its roughly 3 million dead, would have seen the number spiked between 8 and 13 million without any touching the British, Soviet, or Chinese numbers. Remember, this is just how many would have died, not including the maimed, missing, and prisoners of war who all have fallen under the broad term casualty that not even been mentioned. And honestly, I don't think I could get a good estimate for that number. So to condense, drop the bombs that killed 226,000 Japanese, or follow MacArthur across the Japanese home islands in what Truman would describe as an Okinawa from one end of Japan to the other, and have another 5 to 15 million dead in a war that already claimed 85 million. You do the math and tell me which is preferable. And that is the logic I like to apply to the Enclave and Vault Tec in this case. The Vault program, while terrible, honestly downright immoral in pretty much every regard, plays under a different set of rules, just as we had during World War II. It is either do nothing and let the inevitable happen, or test the most awful experiments on select citizens to attempt to have the know-how necessary to rebuild America after a nuclear conflict. Sacrifice a few to save the many. On top of the ongoing Sino-American War, a large portion of war-weary America was openly rebelling against the government, and I must emphasize, this is not how I see the world, but why the Enclave acted the way they did. So many of the rebellious, borderline treasonous citizens were often rounded up and shipped off to secret laboratories like Big MT or Mariposa, along with Chinese prisoners of war to be used as lab rats to test everything from FEV and biological agents to trauma harnesses and as tests for weapons. See Hopeville hippies. And so with this mindset of any personnel and traitors are usable and expendable, what would a slight escalation into who is used as a side effect? Prisoners at the county jail? Sure. Civilian volunteers? Why not? Non-willing participants? Kind of pushing the line a little bit. But this is where you get incidents like Huntersville, a small town in West Virginia that was used as a petri dish for a modified strain of FEV to allow observation of the test subject as not a laboratory, but still a semi-controlled environment where West Tech can monitor and study the effects on the citizens from the laboratory. And with that, you have to ask again what the point of all the suffering is, to which the Enclave says, perfect the development of what would essentially be an inoculation to every and all disease we currently know of, and heightened resistance to radiation, both of which would be a major boost to both the war effort and in the post-war world where illness would run rampant and radiation would saturate the environment. So the logic behind why the isolated town of Huntersville was chosen loops back in on itself with the same question that we already answered, how the Enclave perceives it. It is all for the greater good. And there were a lot of instances where universal inoculation would have been very useful during the Sino-American War. China was infamous for deploying biological weapons like anthrax, smallpox, hemorrhagic fever, family, and SARS, named a few potential candidates, onto the battlefield during the conflict. And an epidemic known as the New Plague, which by the name of Blue Flu and Limit 115 as well, had been sweeping through America since before the war, causing mass panic and the nation's first ever national quarantine to be enacted as a form of containment. So great priority is placed on finding a solution to both the pandemic and the biological weapons at once, and West Tech came through with their artificially manufactured virus. But the Enclave quickly took control and escalated trials from flatworms and mice to prisoners of war, military defectors, and small isolated communities to hopefully one day perfect what was supposed to be a miracle within the realm of science, preventing all diseases. Yet despite all the preparations and planning, the Enclave's secondary goal of rebuilding America had to be enacted after the 2-hour-long Great War almost wiped the world clean of life, forcing them to hold out in their isolated, heavily fortified bunkers, outposts, and aboard control station Enclave until radiation reached an acceptable level, spending the intervening time watching the inhabitants of the wasteland go on with their lives. And what they saw horrified them beyond belief. Raider gangs had sacked entire settlements for drugs, pillaging and raping the inhabitants, deadly mutants that roamed in packs and slaughtered everything in their path, and the ungodly abominations of human, animal, and machine that now dominated the continent pushed the Enclave away from the idea of reclaiming the few remaining settlements under the American banner in favor of the white world clean of life to be receded. Which is a reasonable assessment when you think about how small the Enclave was. Control Station Enclave said only have a few thousand inhabitants at maximum, with only a minority of those being soldiers. So reclaiming large swaths of territory and fighting off near constant attacks was out of the question. Attrition would quickly wear down the Enclave numbers. Even with their advanced space-age power armor and weapons, it would be impractical for them to hold on extended stretches of territory. So the easiest solution, outside of occupying small, heavily fortified bases to call their nation, would be to sterilize the entire wasteland of mutant life and recolonize it again with pure-strained humans, all in the name of rebuilding America and fighting communism. But where does this leave Vault Tec with their fresh ore of context I've just provided? They do have obvious ties to the Enclave, but their motives are kind of questionable. Clearly, it was cash money and political maneuvering the corporations after, but risking their entire reputation and main source of income, selling reservations within vaults. While the most lucrative business opportunities ever known to man just opened across America with millions willing to put anything down for a place within a vault, it does not make practical sense to put everything on the line here when you have so much to lose. So yes, the Vault program did originally fill its advertised role as massive fallout shelter to protect American citizens, but were transformed into inhumane experiments for the shadow government in a desperate plea to gain more power, more favors in Congress, and bigger government contracts. Yet this risky maneuvering did pay off. No whistleblower was able to unravel the conspiracy, and the Vault program carried on its new function effectively post-war, even if I do think it was short-sighted for the corporate board to allow the Enclave to bring the entire Vault program in under their wing. Yet the Vaults were the perfect controlled environments to test whatever experiments were deemed necessary, being large, isolated populations where everything from what they eat and drink to the air they breathe can be controlled, monitored, and manipulated. Giving the Enclave a near perfect sample to work with that is isolated from external elements and will never leave the testing site, so the effects of each experiment can be observed not just the current group, but also the following generations to determine how long-term exposure affects the population. So, as mentioned before, the residents of Vault 75 will put through rigorous trials to test their physical and mental aptitude before either being harvested or recruited onto the science staff. The entire point of which was to make stronger and better humans who would be able to better survive the harsh wastelands above, and possibly use a genetic template for super soldiers. Now I know this sounds Nazi-esque, it really is, but removing the genetic and mental defects of a population would save resources and make any civilization more efficient. Yes, this is eugenics, and yes, it is absolutely abhorrent. I'm still playing devil's advocate. But to drive the point home of how sacrifice in the future say that many may be necessary, let's look at Vault 11 again. The entire purpose of which was to test how an isolated pocket of people would react if told one person had to be sacrificed each year, while the computer claimed the entire population would be killed. Outcome, not good. The Vault broke into bickering voting blocks, and eventually civil war, after the last overseer, Catherine Stone, changed the way each sacrifice was chosen. From the overseer being sent to the execution chamber yearly to a random lottery, which really highlighted how terrible people could be, especially when you realize that if the residents refused to sacrifice anyone in the first place, they would have been commended for their commitment to human life and how it is a shining example to us all. So the Vault was more of a test of ethics than anything, highlighting how far people would go for a sense of security. But I emphasize, all of these experiments were the gathered data or samples that are vital for the Enclave's plans of recolonization. The refined DNA of Vault-summarized specimens, how factional divides affected a small society in both 11 and 19, effects of extended cryopreservation from Vault 111 and 86 was both for fun and to see how long a population of drugged up and violent civilians could last. Turns out 200 plus years. Yet, even with its wealth of knowledge at their fingertips, the Enclave was still hard-pressed to return to the continent. The military was small, yet powerful, but no match for the fledgling NCR or Brotherhood of Steel, both of which outnumber them in men and power armor, but did not have the technological edge. The Enclave had the advantage of being able to strike almost anywhere without warning, thanks to their fleet of vertibirds, and bring the pain with their advanced power armor and weapon designs. But why fight fair when you could end the war in well-thought strike, and prevent a lengthy ground invasion that would cost untold amounts of lives and material? Instead, they chose the biological option, resetting the waste to a lifeless land, where reconstruction of what was lost during the Great War can begin, bringing America back to its former glory. Thank you all so much for watching. I'd like to thank my friend Ecto Express for playing the role of badass Enclave Shock Trooper, and both Seth and Silver for reviewing my script. Leave a like, subscribe, and I will see you in the next video.